You're listening to the Body Literacy Podcast, your connection to the art and science of feeling really good, body, mind, and spirit. I'm your host and holistic health coach, Jen Mayo. If you've never experienced truth and freedom inside your body, an amazing adventure is about to begin. Healing happens in community. Body literacy is your tribe. Join me in discovering the keys to fearlessly unlocking your body's innate intelligence and resilience. Turn on to the wisdom of your body as we connect your wellness dots by exploring whole person healing, from neuroscience and nutrition to sexual health and sleep. Join the wellness revolution and start speaking your body's language. Eric, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. I'm so excited to get started with this conversation. It's kind of controversial and it makes people uncomfortable, but I think that's the whole point of having it.
Oh, definitely. I'm very excited to be here. So thank you for the invitation, Jen.
Fantastic. So I'm just going to kind of start out here. I'm kind of coming to this conversation as a mother, as a lover, and as somebody who's experienced a fair share of my own sexual medical violence. So this topic is very near and dear to my heart. And I don't think there's anyone, at least not in North America, who the topic of circumcision has not impacted them in some capacity or another. And I first came across childhood medical procedures as being a significant source of trauma that might cause health problems later in life in a book called Eastern Body, Western Mind. And that was the first time I had kind of gotten validation for this notion that the medical establishment, while maybe well-intentioned, at least by the people on the ground doing the work, doesn't always have a bigger picture view of what it is they're actually doing to their patients. And we know when we start to look at Eastern philosophy, which is gradually starting to get more integrated into Western medical science, and people are starting to understand the mind-body connection much better, that there is a bigger picture to understand, especially on this topic. And I know you have a really interesting backstory on how you got involved in creating awareness around infant genital mutilation. I think that's probably a more accurate way to term it, circumcision, which we'll get into sort of the particulars of how language is used, especially in medical culture later. But can you kind of give us a background? You gave a one-man show at Harvard that captured a lot of attention, and I don't think the administration there understood that their reaction was actually going to bring a lot more awareness to your cause than had they not had a reaction at all. So for anybody who's just joining this conversation and has not seen your one-man show, which I believe is called Sex and Circumcision, An American Love Story, can you give us kind of a brief rundown of what that was and where it's taken you?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I worked at Harvard on and off for about 8 years when I was an undergrad and then after I graduated. And I had a full-time, I was a full-time employee there, nothing to do with, protecting children from genital mutilation, right? That was just independent activism. But while I was an employee at Harvard, I had developed a lecture for Cornell students. It was called Sex and Circumcision, Identifying Truths and Trends in Genital Cutting Cultures, right? And anyone who has seen my play or performance at Harvard knows it's largely in a lecture-based format with some theatrical elements. And so after I gave this talk at Cornell, I thought, you know what, this talk is important enough in terms of explaining the history and why we continue to mutilate our children's genitals, that it really needs to be done at an appropriate venue for people to understand the magnitude of this harm that continues to happen. So with support of senior faculty at Harvard and my boss, I produced this play called Sex and Circumcision, An American Love Story. And kind of like you alluded to earlier, Harvard's incredibly, let's say, knee-jerk and ignorant reaction put a lot more attention on it, kind of like the Streisand effect. When Barbara Streisand got upset that somebody published her home in a magazine and sued about it, everyone in the nation learned about it because she was fighting this attention, right? And so now it's not as it's well known that Harvard is quick to, let's say, censor reviews or anything controversial or anything that might upset their donors. Back in 2018, I was like one of the initial stories of the big cancel culture in academia, right? It's like, oh, you said something that either upsets our donors or upsets our sensibilities, such as, oh, we're a culture that mutilates our genitals. And instead of actually earnestly engaging with that topic, that conversation, we need to straw man and cancel him, which, Harvard did effectively for a year until I went to Georgetown Law School. So it actually pointed me in the right direction, and I'm grateful in a way. And I was able to separate from Harvard, which is more of a political, financial instead of an educational institution. But so that's kind of how I got here into the legal field, because Harvard promised, look, we're Harvard. We're all for freedom of speech and expression, and you can say what you want and do what you want in your play, and we're going to respect that and not retaliate against you. Now, I was skeptical always, but I was like, okay, we'll give Harvard the opportunity to honor its word, and if they don't, it's going to bring a lot of attention on this important problem where we continue to mutilate our children's genitalia. So it was a double-edged sword. It was helpful and hurtful in ways. But after Harvard terminated me, they moved to terminate my boss as well, because he supported the cause of protecting children from genital mutilation. He supported me. He refused to make up any lies that I had violated any policies. And so instead of keeping my old boss, Tom Hammond, on as an employee who had worked there for 14 years, instead they moved to terminate him. And then he committed suicide right before Harvard was able to terminate him and evict him from Harvard housing. And, he was my best friend at the time, so it was very traumatic. I performed CPR on his corpse. I found his corpse. It was very hard on me in many ways.
Wow.
And so after Harvard essentially broke its word, destroyed my career, destroyed my graduate school aspirations, and then killed my best friend, I was like, you know what? I'm going to sue Harvard, because I spoke with a bunch of attorneys. They said Harvard said they weren't going to do this thing, retaliate for expressing your opinion. And they did that as extreme as they could. And, even win or lose, it's going to be a learning experience. And so I was lucky enough to get accepted and attend Georgetown Law School. I learned the law. I sued Harvard. And, the first district court judge, who was not just a Harvard Law alumnus, but golfing buddies with Harvard's counsel, threw the lawsuit out in 15 days, which violates what's called the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure. I appealed it. The appellate court essentially stuck their head in the sand for 2 years, didn't address the issue on appeal. I filed a petition to the Supreme Court of the United States. And when the Supreme Court justices, their clerks and their analysts, full-time attorneys on staff, read my petition, they said, wow, this is a very obvious case of the judiciary toadying to power and not actually applying the rules consistently to everybody. And so they assigned my case the number one case of the 2023 term. Of the thousands of petitions they received, they're like, this is the most important, the easiest to rule on, something that would give the justices an opportunity to show that they actually administer justice and are not administering favors for their billionaire friends or whatever it is they do. And when the justices saw my petition, they promptly denied it and said, we're not going to touch this. And so it's like, okay, I'm not at least with this cause of protecting children from genital mutilation, I'm not going to be interfacing with the federal courts anytime soon. If you look at a lot of other progressive causes like marriage equality, the decriminalization and legalization of cannabis, legalization of end-of-life medication and things like that, often they're done on a state-by-state level. Civil rights, women's rights, you name it. And then once there's enough support on the state level, then the federal government has the chutzpah, the courage to deal with this, because the federal government is rarely leading in rights. They're typically trailing. And so the game plan now, because, I'm not fighting Harvard, the federal courts are not going to be involved, at least in these early stages, is now I'm just focusing on a state-by-state basis, raising this issue, this problem, is why do we only protect one class of children and not protect all children from genital mutilation?
Yeah.
And to kind of give you some context, when I say one class, I just mean females. And it's great that we protect females from genital mutilation at birth. But most states have guarantees in their state constitution that the laws will equally protect all of its citizens, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you have a law that only protects one gender of child from genital mutilation, then that would violate the state's constitution.
Right.
Very simple, very easy argument. And it's an argument that my law firm is going to multiply across as many states as feasible and responsible to do so. And so the first state we're going to be suing is Oregon, and that's going to be in the near future after Intact Global, the nonprofit that's funding this, raises probably about $30,000 is the estimate, right? And then once we have that little runway, I and my law firm will file that lawsuit in Oregon and then see how that develops. And as that's developing, we'll start suing other states because we need the judiciary of various states to recognize the inequality here and say, look, legislature, it's great that you protect girls from female genital mutilation, and you should. Right. At the same time, if we have a constitution that says we protect our citizens equally from the same harms or similar harms, then we need to protect all children from genital mutilation. Mm-hmm. And a big problem with that is just ignorance, right? Because a lot of Americans, myself included, for the first almost 20 years of my life, had no idea that the foreskin of the penis was about 15 square inches, about the size of my palm, most of the erogenous tissue, all of the mobility. It keeps the head of the penis protected through life. It facilitates intercourse, and cutting it off is an act of extreme pain and torture where infants literally will scream so loud that their lungs, their stomachs have exploded. They've died by bleeding out and infections. Some have lost their penises. I mean, there are incredibly damaging effects from mutilating an infant. And the only reason it's been able to last so long is we use this Latin euphemism, circumcision, right? If we called it what it was, infant genital mutilation, then parents wouldn't consent to it.
Right.
But because doctors, and you're very familiar with this, because doctors say, oh, you should circumcise, or they ask for it, then parents not unreasonably, but mistakenly believe that there's some medical benefit to cutting off 40 to 50% of the skin on an infant's penis for no medical reason. But doctors get to charge money for it. And because we have a for-profit health system, there's incentives to perform medically unnecessary surgeries. And if there was a poster boy for medically unnecessary surgeries, it would be infant circumcision. So that's my beginning spiel. I don't know if I answered your question, but
no. That was great. We definitely covered a lot of area there. And I don't think most people realize, a hospital is a business and they have a sales funnel. So if you think about like when you go on Instagram or something and you see an ad for something and you click on it and it's free or whatever, and you go and you get the free thing, and then they funnel you into something else. And when you buy that, there's something else, There is a sales process here. It is a for-profit business system. And I think especially in the context of understanding informed consent, we have to understand that there are so many weak links in that system. Even if there is a consent form involved, we're still dealing with a biased system that is going to make money off of you consenting to a procedure, whether that procedure is necessary, moral, or anything else. So there's a myriad of problems. And I talk a lot too, we've had other podcasts, and I'll just mention briefly here for anybody who's enjoying this conversation and wants to get some other angles of it as well. We've had Brendan Marotta on in the past to talk about American Circumcision, his film, and his latest book, Children's Justice. We've had Dr. Christiane Northrup on to also talk in part about circumcision in her conversation on sexuality and spirituality in medicine. Tony Naj was on. We talked about sexual medical violence and an experience she had in the medical system, as well as Dr. Darshan Narvaez, who's a psychologist at the University of Notre Dame. And She was the first person I had on to talk about this. Her focus is mostly on attachment parenting and understanding the early childhood experiences and how they impact us later in life. And I'll share one thing that she had shared with me, maybe not specifically in that interview, but I went to the University of Notre Dame and had a conversation with her when this particular issue came to the forefront for myself. And she had written a myriad of articles for Psychology Today, opposing circumcision. And there was one of her colleagues on there as well that I believe was writing at the time. And there were a lot of articles opposing circumcision at the time. But I believe at this point in time, the American Academy of Pediatrics was still recommending routine circumcision kind of as a standard of care. And because of that, Psychology Today, at least for a period of time, put a ban on being able to say anything negative about circumcision. I think that eventually got lifted. I went to their website the other day just to see if there was anything more recent, and there have been a few things, but not like that time period prior to like 2015-ish. So there's so many things to unpack here, and especially from a trauma perspective. And you mentioned, the agonizing pain that infants are put through in this procedure, and the outward appearance of the screaming and clear signs of pain that they're in. Like, that's not even a question anymore. But I think what's almost even more concerning is if you have an infant that's not having a reaction, because we know that in these extreme traumatic states that people, and especially babies in this instant, will go into a freeze state or a state of shock where they're not even able, they're so withdrawn into themselves in a protective mode that they're not expressing those signs. So I wouldn't say that the expression of pain is even what's necessarily the most concerning part of this. Even outside of that lens, we're talking about personal autonomy and the sovereignty of each person's individual body. And we're talking about a person that's completely defenseless and can't speak for themselves. And there are so many implications of this is just a routine thing we do to the weakest of our population. And as a human rights issue, as a social rights issue, it's almost unfathomable to me that we even have to have this conversation at this point in time. But just even in the last decade or even 5 years, I've seen such a shift. Do you know what the statistics are now? I know it used to be 85% of the population was circumcised in North America. Has that changed in recent years?
Yes. So it used to be, between 85, 90%. Some religious circumcisions sometimes aren't counted in the statistics, and we're talking 60s, 70s. Now it's much closer to 50% in the US. Okay. So we're talking about 30, 40% drop. And like a lot of other progressive causes, they're not linear, they're exponential, right? And so that's the goal here, right? And that's why I'm grateful to be on your podcast, as many podcasts as we can get on, is because, it's time to end this, right? This is absolutely absurd. We're mutilating infants for no medical purpose, causing incredible immediate pain and lifelong loss of sexual function, of autonomy, as you mentioned, because like you said, well, especially in America, in our legal theory, each of us is a sovereign. We get to decide the important decisions about our own bodies, right? And if you look at countries that do not mutilate their infants, which is the great majority of them, over 99% of men who are not genitally mutilated or circumcised at birth decide to keep their entire penis because it is an exceptionally important part of your penis. It is like the eyelids. To say your eyelids are not important is absurd. It just makes no sense.
Right.
And the pediatric body that used to recommend it retracted their recommendation. They said, we no longer recommend this. Like, they no longer recommend lobotomies or female circumcision, right? I mean, that is the category that this child abuse masquerading as a medical procedure fits in. So there is no actual medical, scientific, ethical authority that's promoting this. And to the contrary, secular medical bodies all across the world, Australia, New Zealand, the Netherlands, Germany, most of Europe, they're like, you need to respect the child's right to bodily integrity, not perform medically unnecessary surgeries, and because this is important parts of your body. Now, a lot of them want to be culturally, religiously sensitive, and I sympathize with that viewpoint, and we should be. We also need to do what is best for the child and what's best for children, and what's best for them is to not violently mutilate their genitals at birth. Right. So it's like, come on, we need to be adults and do the right thing.
Right. Can you give us a little bit of a history on the religious origins of the practice of circumcising? Especially in the Jewish culture, it's very much a rite of passage. And I know I've talked to Dr. Christian Northrup about this too, about we don't need to get rid of the rite of passage or there being a ceremony involved. You can still have a version of that doesn't involve blatantly abusing a child or amputating part of their body.
Mm-hmm. Well, definitely. And so I don't know if we mentioned this, but I'm Jewish, right? I grew up in a Jewish household. I am Jewish. You've got the DNA test to prove it, right?
Okay.
Let me tell you. So, I have a lot of close Jewish friends and family who I love and appreciate. And the majority of them are 100% on board. It's time that we protect our children and stop mutilating them. But if you grow up in this culture that only tells you that, you're the chosen one and we need to mutilate our infants to prove it, it's really hard to break free of that, even if you're an adult and well-educated, because it's not something that people discuss, right?
Yeah.
But the reason that my Jewish people adopted circumcision or genital mutilation is at the time, they were one tribe of many tribes in Africa, Middle East, and there were tribes around them that were literally sacrificing their children, killing them for the gods to make sure the droughts didn't come, or whatever causal theory they had that was not accurate, but they didn't know any better. And so the Jewish people, my people, were like, okay, we're not going to kill our children. We're just going to mutilate their genitals. We're going to do a great step down, which, was progressive for the time, is the way you can look at it. But everyone knew at the time, as they did when we adopted circumcision in a big way in the American medical system, that the foreskin was healthy and erogenous tissue. The overt explanation for some Jewish leaders, some rabbis, was, we're going to circumcise our children to excise their sexual pleasure and to check his pride. It makes them easier to control. That's why Genesis 17, it's not only do we circumcise our Jewish boys, but we circumcise our slaves, right? And, I'm quoting Philo Judaeus now, who is a rabbi at the turn of the millennium around 30 AD, right? Which, the time of Jesus as well, which is kind of not super relevant. But he was circumcised, but he never preached circumcision. He preached against it. So if you're Christian and circumcised, it's important to know that is actually somewhat violative of your religion. Is Christianity does not promote circumcision. It promotes circumcision of the heart, essentially meaning we're no longer requiring or promoting mutilating infants, which is probably one of the major reasons Christianity caught on, because you didn't have to mutilate yourself or your child to be part of it. Right. It's a smart recruitment mechanism. But so what happened, and I would definitely count myself as one of these individuals, but a lot of Jews who were circumcised did not want to be circumcised, right? So what they would do, especially the Hellenistic Jews, the Jews who fit in with Greek culture around the turn of the millennium, first couple hundred years after the birth of Jesus, whatever, they would take their remnant foreskin, they would stretch it over the head of the penis and tie it with maybe a knot or something, because what that would do would allow them to fit in with Gentile culture, right? The culture that didn't mutilate their infants at birth. And that was seen as a renunciation of Jewish identity for the rabbis, the hardcore, Orthodox Jewish elders whose entire identity and sense of value revolves around this religion. And so to combat this trend of adult Jewish males saying, you know what, I no longer identify with this genitally mutilating aspect of my identity or my tribe, they radicalized the circumcision. So from just cutting off the tip of the foreskin to removing all of the inner mucosa to about 40-50% of the skin on the penis. And this extreme version of genital mutilation that the rabbis instituted in 200 AD is the exact same version that America adopted in a medical sense, right? Mm. It's not a coincidence, but the point is, these are extreme forms of genital mutilation. It's not like, oh, you're just cutting off a piece of the penis. You're cutting off about 15 square inches with, 24 functions, right? And so this extreme version of genital mutilation from 200 AD all the way to pretty much present day. And what the Jewish people used to do is after they would mutilate the infant with their fingernails, they would actually suck on the baby's penis afterwards. Right. And they did this from like 200 to 1850 AD approximately, right? So about 1650 years. And then even in the 19th century, a lot of my fellow Jewish people and Gentiles were like, okay, I think you really should abandon the infant penis sucking, because right. The infant bloody penis sucking, excuse me, it gets worse. And most of my Jewish people did. At the same time, there's still like some hardcore Orthodox sects in mm-hmm. Brooklyn, New York, who continue to suck on the bleeding infant penises. And that's a huge problem. I mean, that's child molestation by any sober analysis.
Right.
Yeah.
Where is Child Protective Services in all this?
Well, the law is largely political. And by that, I mean judges, law enforcement, executive officers. They will do what they believe in, that they believe that they can get away with. And I don't necessarily mean that in a bad way, but mm-hmm. let's say the mayor of New York's like, you know what, we're going to cut down on, bloody infant penis sucking. There's going to be a huge outcry from the Orthodox community and then the conservative Jewish religious community. They'll say, oh, well, this is an attack on our religion, and we need to do everything we can to politically dethrone this individual, which is kind of what happened to me at Harvard, if they're mm-hmm. going to, talk ill about our religious blood sacrifices, right? And so sometimes it's just not worth the battle for politicians to combat religious child abuse. Now, obviously, I would not fall in that category. I am happy to go to bat for what I believe in, which is protecting children from genital mutilation. But there are some individual adults who have a lot of resources and will spend that on combating anything they perceive to be a threat to their religion, which might also be a threat to their physical identity, which can stem from historical trauma. As you know what I mean. So there's a lot of trauma-based thinking in the Jewish religion, and that leads to poor outcomes, because if you are acting from a place of fear or insecurity or trauma, you're not going to be doing things that are, let's say, logic and ethics based, but just more knee-jerk reaction, which is why it's hard for a lot of Jewish individuals and my Jewish people to have an honest conversation about this, because it's like, oh, well, this is my identity. It's like, well, it's not identity for female girls to have their genitals mutilated. So, and they seem to be doing just fine, and they're just as Jewish as us Jewish boys. So why don't we just cut a pomegranate and have a naming ceremony?
Right.
So, which makes all the sense in the world. Right. And we will get there. But that's not the immediate or even the near future. We are just trying to protect, most boys whose parents don't have some religious, affinity for mutilating their children. Right.
Yeah.
And that can be later. But right now, we're going with the secular, what's best for most of us. And that's obviously protecting our autonomy, our fundamental human and civil rights to make important decisions about our own body, and not inflict extreme pain and lifelong sexual loss on children and infants. Right. I mean, it just makes all the sense in the world.
Right. Absolutely. And do you think, we're at this kind of 50-50 tipping point? It was different when 85% of the population was doing it. But if we're at a point where it's half and half basically at this point, and the main argument that I think most parents are making this decision on is, oh, we want him to look the same as his father.
Yeah.
But now if we're at a 50-50 point, do you think that kind of makes this the most advantageous time to start pursuing this from a legal standpoint? Because we do have half the population that is sort of awakened to this is an atrocity.
Yeah, I think it is a perfect time to raise this issue in as many courts as possible, the issue of equal protection of children from genital mutilation. Like, as you said, 50%, and each state is different. Like the Midwest is 80%, Oregon is like 20 to 17% of kids,
Oh, wow.
of baby boys are generally mutilated, which means less than 10%, about 8.5 or 1 in 12 children are, or let's put it the affirmative way, 11 out of 12 children in Oregon are protected from genital mutilation. And so my law firm is going to come into that state, pro hoc vice, the court permitting, and we're going to argue, look, 12 out of 12 children should be protected from genital mutilation.
Yeah.
And we'll do that in as many states as possible. But this is the perfect time to raise as many legal challenges as possible on the legality and the constitutionality of only protecting one class of child and not protecting all children from genital mutilation.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow, that's amazing. Yeah. Can we talk a little bit too about anatomy here? Because I think some people hear this and they don't understand what the big deal is. And there's a saying that goes, you don't know what you don't know until you do know. And then I'll add, you can't unknow what you know now.
Yeah.
And I don't think most people, what male or female, understand what's missing if they don't have any experience with an intact penis and what that might mean from an anatomical or physical standpoint, as well as a mental and spiritual angle on that as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, so two separate things. I mean, they definitely overlap, but if we talk about the anatomy of the tissue that is being amputated from children, right? Americans are largely squeamish about the genitals and sex in general because we have no sex education as children. In Europe, in many countries, they'll just introduce the idea of love and families at early age, and then talk about more specifics as you get older, which makes sense, right? Because these are, as you mentioned in the email to me, exceptionally important parts of life, and obviously the continuation of our species. I mean, like these are important things, right?
Yeah.
And what you're doing to an infant is you're taking the most erogenous part, sensitive part of his body, and you're putting thousands of pounds of force on it and cutting it off, right? It's medieval torture by any sober analysis.
Yes.
And what the foreskin is a non-sexual analogy would be the foreskin is the lips of the penis, right? It is where the outer skin of the penis goes to the inner mucosa. And just for people to be kind of familiar with this, skin would be like the skin on my face here. The inner mucosa would be like inside your lips, right? Mm-hmm. And your lips are the transition from the skin to the inner mucosa, right?
Yeah.
And so if you're circumcised, you will literally see a scar on your penis where you were sexually assaulted as an infant. And that scar, below the scar, will be the skin of the penis. And on the other side of the scar will be where the inner mucosa is, but it won't be moist like the inside of your mouth or my mouth because the covering was literally stolen from you in a violent manner as an infant. So the foreskin is that tissue that goes, it's a bilayer tissue, 2 layers that goes essentially the skin of the penis to the tip, which is called the ridged band, which is the male G-spot, where most of the nerve endings are. It's why when you kiss someone, most of the sensations in your lips, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And then it folds into itself and attaches where the other part of the scar line is in circumcision. Mm-hmm. And so not only is most of the erogenous nerve endings, they concentrated in the foreskin, that tissue that's removed, but that tissue is supposed to move. The penis is a moving tissue, organ structure, whatever you want to call it. Right. And it's supposed to slide in and out of itself during intercourse. and it reduces friction. If we talk about heterosexual sex, it reduces friction in the vaginal orifice. It keeps the lubrication in. And just like the inside of your mouth and lips, it actually secretes its own lubricants. So it reduces the need for any type of artificial lubricant you buy at CVS or whatever, because we evolved in the wild, and we're not supposed to need any type of external lubricant to masturbate or have sex. And when you see that in pop culture in America, that is a trend in a genital cutting culture, right?
Right.
And it's also hard to conceive, because we look at, let's say, not to throw China under the bus, but hundreds or thousands of years ago, they used to bind their girls' feet, right?
Right.
And we can immediately see, wow, what an obviously violent and wrong act that reduces function and has weird kind of sexual connotations. And immediately we see that. Well, the genital mutilation of male infants, or circumcision, is exactly the same. It removes an incredible amount of function to create this artificial and cultural delusion that the circumcised penis is anything but a man-made creation designed to dull the sexual pleasures, which is what rabbis have been saying since its inception, right? And that is why American doctors adopted it as well. Only in like the last 50 years did they change their tune, because 70s, 80s, it's like, oh, sexual pleasure may not be bad, so we need to change the justification, because otherwise people aren't going to do it. But the reality is, you're removing the same tissue and you're having the same negative outcomes, which is far less sexual pleasure, far less orgasms, less control over orgasms, more friction, more pounding, much more violent sex. It's has a litany of terrible outcomes, and that's because this is important tissue. Just like if you were to literally amputate the lips of children, you're going to have not just disfigurement, but dysfunction. And that's what you have both with neonatal circumcision.
Right. But if everybody was walking around without lips on their face, we would tend to think that was normal.
Well, yeah. I mean, it shows how powerful culture is. And also, we don't typically expose our genitals in this culture, right? We're not a naturist or nudist culture. But if we had more, let's say, non-sexual nudity, then people would see the different penises type, the intact and the circumcised, and they would start asking the right questions. Why do we do this? Is this harmful? Yes, it is harmful. Should we stop doing it? Yes. Right. But it's something people don't see, and then they don't discuss. And that's why it's so important, that you're raising awareness about this. So thank you for having me on. And we're just going to keep doing. We're going to keep pushing until all children are protected. That's the mission. And there's going to be no, let's say, there will be no lightening of that mission, or no relenting, or however you want to say it. Because this doesn't have to be aggressive, but it is going to be a final decision where we're going to stop mutilating our children.
Yeah. Yeah. And, in the historical context, I think we have to understand that back when these practices were maybe incepted, there were more social circumstances and athletic competitions where men were competing in the nude, or in social situations where people were naked together and might see each other more. It's almost kind of like difficult to wrap your head around, because most of us wear clothes most of the time, at least if we're in public. So it's kind of like, well, what's the big deal? Nobody's seeing it anyway. But if it's just something that's been passed on from generation to generation, because my dad did it and his dad did it to him, and so forth and so on. But we're at a level of awareness now, I think, and I think there are consciousness is such a popular thing coming into the culture now, where I think we realize in a variety of ways we've been living very unconsciously and not asking questions and not being curious about why it is we do the things we do, and having cultural awareness as well as self-awareness around topics like this, I think, are pivotal to creating a vastly different looking future, in so many ways, but especially in the medical culture. That I think this issue in particular is like at the ground level of that. Like, if we're treating the weakest and most defenseless members of our population in such an abusive manner, that says something about the the culture and society as a whole, and where we're headed. So the fact that we're even at, maybe a collective 50% versus 85 or 90%, I think is, indicative of where we're heading. And I think you're right that this likely will be an issue that turns fairly quickly, much like gay marriage and some other social issues did, both through litigation and social pressures. Back to the anatomy for a second, though. I don't think most people understand. I've had conversations with girlfriends and both sides of this, both friends who have experience with men who have both versions, as well as women who have no experience with anything other than a circumcised penis. I don't think people understand the sexual act is intended to be a mucous membrane to mucous membrane contact where the foreskin is almost like a gasket, if you will. And I think on the sexual shame part of things, we think about this more in terms of men, and being ashamed in the locker room if they don't look like, the guy next to them or whatever. But I think there's a lot of shame absorbed by women on this subject too, because there's a lot of quote unquote sexual dysfunction that gets applied to women because their anatomy is not working with anatomy that's been altered. So when you have women who are experiencing quote unquote vaginal dryness, it may not actually be that her vagina is dry. It's that the equipment she's working with isn't working in the way it was intended to work with her own body. So I think there's a lot of nuances for both men and women in the sexual realm. Definitely in terms of the experience of sexual pleasure as well. There's a distinct difference, and I've never met a penis I didn't like. Not that I've seen that many, but they're all beautiful. They're all wonderful in their own way. But there definitely is a difference in how they function. And I'll say, from an Eastern philosophy perspective, we understand that sexual energy is life force energy. And the flow of energy through the body and our understanding of the meridians in the body is very much connected to, the genitals and the heart being connected. And I think this is one of the bigger areas that's very difficult to quantify. We can look at the anatomy, and understand the mechanics of things and why that might be problematic. But when we look at it more on an energetic and spiritual level, it's very difficult to quantify, this experience that you had before you even have memory of life, impacting your ability to connect with other human beings, your ability to experience pleasure with other, with women or whoever you're partnered with. There is a much bigger conversation to be had that extends beyond what I think the Western medical model is capable of even participating in, because they have been so segmented out of the mind-body conversation, and they're kind of trying to catch up now, but they're having a lot of trouble. Because they come from a triage system of medical care, which is so much different than what actual healthcare is. And I think understanding the importance of those bodily experiences in cultivating spiritual growth and expansion and our ability to collaborate and co-create with other human beings in a sexual and non-sexual capacity is very much linked to those traumas in early childhood, especially when it involves the genitals. And that's largely been ignored, I think. And we know the brain is actually the largest sex organ for both sexes. So can you elaborate any more on just how is the brain also impacted beyond just the physical mechanics of the body?
Absolutely. So one of the kind of more pernicious aspects of genital cutting cultures in the United States of America is definitely one of them, is men or women's sexuality, it is tied to their self-image of themselves, and to understand that, oh, I had an important part of my sex organ removed as an infant is not something that would enhance one's sexual image usually, right? And so to maintain that delusion, they need to convince themselves, and it's easy when the mainstream media would often recite this misinformation, that circumcision is healthier or improves sexual pleasure, which is obviously nonsense. Right. But when let's say the New York Times or the Boston Globe, which have published stories like this in the past, they have in recent years, which is good. But in the past, when they'd say, "Oh, it's healthy to have a big part of your penis cut off," it's easy to believe that because it reinforces your sense of sexual self, right? And so, like you said, the brain is the biggest sex organ that you have, and self-confidence and your own self-image and sexual self-image, it is easier to maintain that when you believe the lie that your culture gave you, that having parts of your genitals mutilated is good for you, right? So that's one of the more difficult and unfortunate aspects as we go on this healing journey together, is we're going to have to acknowledge as adult males or young males or whoever you are, that, oh, what happened to me wasn't great, or it was harmful. And even if it was harmful to me, I'm a big enough man to say, look, I don't want other children to be harmed from this. And even if you don't reach that level of maturity, if you were cut as an infant, you just don't fight it, right? Just let it happen. Let the movement complete and protect children. So those are the two options, but there's a lot of psychology going on there. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but that is certainly part of the problem, right? That's more psychological than actual anatomical.
Right. And I read one statistic that said circumcised men were 4.5 times more likely to have to use erectile dysfunction drugs later in life. And I think there's a massive disconnect between understanding that these early childhood experiences, especially something as brutal as circumcision, might impact a man's sexuality to that extent in a physical sense later in life, that most people aren't looking at the long-term ramifications. And we know that through the ACEs study, so that's the Adverse Childhood Events study, that the more adverse events that are experienced during childhood, and that I don't think that study even took into account infancy. It was older children, but we start to see a much bigger picture. The more insults a child has, the more likely they are to have mental and physical diseases later in life that maybe don't show up right away, but again, on that energetic level, are priming the body for a variety of issues later in life.
Oh, yeah. I mean, because when you're removing the sensory tissue, the foreskin, which is what it is, extremely sensitive erogenous tissue, you're desensitizing and dehumanizing the individual. And it is much harder to connect with others if you've undergone these extreme trauma, pre-verbal, memory, right? And then, well, not only is it harder to connect with other individuals, right? But then I could talk about my own experience, but then to come to terms with the fact that, your parents, not just your culture, but your parents, your closest individuals, put you through this. They consented to having important part of your body amputated and mutilated. And then, at least in my experience, having my Jewish father throw it in my face and say, you should be grateful for it. I mean, and he was totally off the rails, an ignorant moron. And he's come a long way in, 10 years. And now my family doesn't circumcise anymore. But, that can it can really estrange you from your family. It can really damage your sense of self, create a sense of, and this is just coming to terms, and those who live, let's say, with this unconscious trauma, it's hard to quantify, and everyone deals with it differently. I mean, I've heard doulas say after the circumcision of an infant, I could see the spark and the eyes of the child leave, and he no longer
Right.
wants to be part of the society. And I totally get it. If your first
Yeah.
major experience is having the most erogenous part of your penis violently torn apart, it's like, dude, I don't want to be here. Like, let's end this experiment of life now. Now, I'm not
Right.
suggesting anyone should do that, but that is the curse that we are giving our
Right.
children. And it's so easy to stop because it requires nothing, right? Just don't do
Right.
anything. Right?
Right. Well, and I don't think people have the context to really like understand, especially if they've never witnessed this procedure, which I definitely recommend. American Circumcision, the film, is a great place to start if you're wanting more information on the subject. But I mean, this is in fact the first sexual experience a boy has in his life, and it's frequently with a man. And I don't think people understand that the child's penis is actually stimulated to erection to be able to perform the procedure.
Mm-hmm. So we have these medical professionals molesting children and then mutilating their genitals with no medical need. And
Yeah.
by any sober analysis, it would constitute fraud because they are performing medically unnecessary surgeries and then usually billing Medicaid for it. So the public
Right.
treasury. And I mean, it's outrageous in many ways. It's a battery because there is no medical need and you're literally sawing the genitals off of a child. And it's a
Right.
breach of fiduciary duty. And what that means is if you're, let's say, a lawyer or a doctor, you're a fiduciary to your client or patient, meaning you have to put your patient's interest above your own or your client's interest above your own. It's the client's or the patient's interest that matters. But if you are harming a newborn infant who is perfectly healthy to enrich yourself so you can bill Medicaid or Medicare for this, it's Medicaid, then you are putting your interests above the patient's, and that's also a breach of fiduciary duty. So there's a bunch of legal theories that circumcision or male genital mutilation obviously violates. Now, is it something that the Clopper law firm is going to be litigating? Probably not, just because it's easier to litigate constitutional issues because you don't have to say to a doctor or medical association, you lose and you pay this much money, right? Which should happen. And it's something that my law firm may entertain if it gets there. But that the purpose of this movement to protect children is not to punish anybody. It's not to get money or to imprison anybody. It's just to protect children, right? And if we all consent to do that, nobody else needs to get hurt. And I mean that in a very literal way, because right now, thousands of kids in the US are being mutilated because accurate information about it is suppressed. People who talk about it in a professional sense sometimes get retaliated against by people who feel strongly about mutilating children. My Harvard career was terminated because of my advocacy to protect children from genital mutilation, which was difficult at the time. It eventually led me to Georgetown Law and to starting my own law firm. So it was ultimately a good thing. But, there are significant risks of about discussing and trying to address this problem. So, but we're moving in the right direction. Like you said, we're about a 50% circumcision rate. And I think that we can get that very close to zero if people support the movement. And I'm just going to throw a little plug in there. If you support Intact Global, intactglobal.org, become a monthly donor, that's going to fund impact litigation on this, right? That's an easy way to get involved. And I'll probably say that a bunch of times. And that's why I'm eager to go in as many podcasts, not just to raise awareness, but to actually get people who feel passionate about this. Okay, let's get involved. This is an easy way to get involved. Another way to get involved is to put me on a podcast, put other people who do the work on a podcast, share this podcast, whatever you can do, but it's about raising the collective consciousness.
Absolutely. I love that. And I will make sure to include intactglobal.org in the show notes so people can reference that directly. Did you end up going to law school because of this situation, or was that something you had already planned on?
I had no intention to go to law school ever. Right? It sounded really boring and terrible.
Yeah.
And I was a physics major. That's where I was going to go to graduate school at Harvard in data science. That was the plan. And when I spoke with one of the faculty on the admissions board, he said, well, this Jewish faculty member blackballed you, but just apply next year and, I'll vouch for you. So that was kind of the plan, right? And then when Harvard terminated me, I knew I needed to sue Harvard because I told Harvard for months, because they investigated me for
Yeah.
months, right? And then they stole some naked images of me when they were investigating. They tried to blackmail my boss to lie about my work performance, to terminate me. They did a lot of illegal, shady stuff, and it was obviously illegal. And so I was like, okay, well, now I got to sue you, right? I know that you're, more powerful than the state, and as they've shown the federal judiciary, but I'm going to do it anyways, and we'll see what happens. And my mentor at the time, and one of my lawyers who's giving me counsel, he suggested law school because I was looking at different PhD programs, and I was like, you know what, this makes sense. This puts me in a position to effectively advocate for this cause, because there are some career activists, let's call them, and I appreciate their work, and they do good work, and we want to give gratitude for the work they've done in this field and other fields. But I'm not a career intactivist, right? An anti-circumcision activist. I want to get this done in like 2 years, right? If we're well funded, we can solve this problem in short order, because the other side is so obviously heinous. They are mutilating infants for profit, right? So we just need to have our day in court and have the legislatures address this issue with sober glasses on and say, look, we're not going to do this anymore. But I had no intention to go to law school, but I'm very grateful I did. And getting into Georgetown Law and an academic scholarship was a great outcome to the play. I was like, okay, it is what it is. That it was meant to be. And I was able to separate myself from Harvard before any further affiliation would do damage to my reputation, because at this point, they're kind of like, they're the black sheep in academia, because they're not an academic institution for the most part. So, it was all good.
Did you know every single cell in your body needs minerals, and most people are mineral deficient? Industrial agriculture has created an epidemic of mineral depleted soil, and eating even organically grown fruits and vegetables provides far less minerals and nutrient density than the same foods grown a century ago. I take Beam Minerals every day, and this is one supplement I keep on auto ship so I don't run out. Beam contains fulvic and humic acid complexes, which support mineralization, hydration, cellular health, and especially detoxification. Fulvic complexes carry nutrients into your cells and toxins out of your cells. Humic complexes gather and then rid your body of toxins, biowaste, free radicals, and heavy metals. This is the supplement that helps all of your other supplements and nutrition do their jobs. Check out the Jen's Favorite Things tab at jenmayo.com and use Jen20 for 20% off your purchase of Beam Minerals, or save even more on auto ship.
I think it's interesting that I've seen numerous accounts at this point of people either in the medical field or involved with a medical issue like this, going on to get their going on to law school. Dr. Thomas Levy is actually one of the early doctors who I really came to appreciate his body of work. He's a cardiologist, but then got involved with the politics of holistic dentistry, and witnessed how state licensing boards and medical associations would destroy somebody's career for not towing the line of whatever is being promoted in the politics of medicine. And I think it's unfortunate, that people can't just dedicate their lives to helping people through the health sciences and arts, that it has become such a legally charged, we've developed so many legally charged issues within the medical system, especially with, big pharma basically owning agencies, federal agencies and so forth. So I applaud, your passion in pursuing this and getting involved from the legal aspect. Do you think we've used academia, and I'm going to put in air quotes, medical science here, to discredit common sense, because I hear so many arguments. Well, there's not a double-blind placebo-controlled study that shows that they're experiencing X amount of pain, and it's just from this, it's not from these other factors. Like, at some point we have to say, like, this is just common sense. Like, you don't abuse children.
Oh, yeah, it's obviously common sense. And there is an incredible body of literature specifically on male genital mutilation called infant neonatal circumcision. See, if I were a medical professional and I were to propose a study that, let's say, measures the pitch on how loud a baby girl screams when you're cutting off her labia as an infant, it would not even, you'd probably maybe not lose your medical license. That's probably a high bar, but your reputation would tank, and they would say, no, of course you can't do that. But if you look at male circumcision, there are studies that literally will measure the pitch of a male infant screaming as he's having his genitals torn off and amputated. And what the study found, which is not at all surprising, is when the foreskin is being crushed with thousands of pounds of force and you're taking a scalpel to this penis, that's when the infant scream was the loudest and the shrillest. And it's like, obviously, right? Like, we have an incredible amount of data that shows that babies are going through an incredible practically inconceivable amount of pain when they are undergoing a circumcision, because you are mutilating the most sensitive part of their penis, right? You don't need a medical study, like you said, to show this. It's just, it's ridiculous. And even if there were medical benefits to circumcision, and if you were to look at the sexual health outcomes of Europe, country that does not mutilate its infants, and America, country that mutilates its male infants, Europe has way lower rates of sexually transmitted diseases and HIV, which suggests that the foreskin actually protects you from some level of STD transmission, which makes sense because the foreskin facilitates intercourse and reduces friction dramatically, which means there's less bleeding, there's less, let's say, coarse skin that could easily break. And that blood-to-blood contact is where at least HIV can be transmitted, but other STDs and STIs as well. So it doesn't matter what the studies say, but they're overwhelming in their conclusion that boys go through unbearable pain when they are circumcised. Some dissociate from reality and go into shock. And the long-term health outcomes and sexual outcomes are way worse. There was another study, I think it was, let me take a look, 1999, where they found that women who had intact partners, men who were not circumcised, came to orgasm from vaginal intercourse twice as often as men who were circumcised, which makes all the sense in the world, considering that is how the genitals evolved to stimulate each other.
Yeah, exactly. And kind of back to my point on, the shame aspect of women absorbing something because the act is not as it's designed. And I think there's so much around, there used to be the term frigidity. I think we've excluded that from the culture at this point because it's so derogatory. But the idea that women aren't psychologically primed or open enough or whatever to receive that experience, when in fact it's that the act itself has been altered in a way that limits their ability to access that.
Oh, yeah. Well, protecting male infants from genital mutilation is also a woman's health issue, as you've touched on multiple times, because a lot of sexual problems women experience and then they're blamed for is actually because their partner has a big part of his penis missing that is important in sexual function, right? Yeah. So, and also, as we mentioned earlier, it's also important for women's safety, emotional, and sexual relationships to stop mutilating male infants, because it makes the man more empathetic, more emotionally available, more present if he wasn't violently and sexually abused as an infant, right? It's like, a good way to... There's a couple ways, because we love our dogs, right? And we can make many analogies to our dogs. Like, you wouldn't circumcise your dog just right off the bat. You wouldn't cut up part of his penis. But also, if you have two puppies from the same litter and you love one of them and the other you abuse chronically, like in his early days, and then treat them the same as adults, those puppies are not going to act the same. One is going to be
Mhm.
very reactive and violent and kind of feel unsafe and manifest those behaviors of feeling unsafe. And the other is going to be a normal, loving dog, right?
Mhm.
And when humans are mammals, just like dogs are, and if you're going to violently abuse infants, it's going to have an effect on him for the rest of his life, and it's going to be subconscious, but it is going to be there. It's hard to quantify, but if you just
Yeah.
look at the warring nations, they're typically the genitally mutilating ones. America, the Middle East, that's where most of the conflicts are, and that's where most of the men have had their genitals mutilated.
Right.
I read a study once where of the last 24 genocides, 23 of them had genitally mutilating cultures on one or both sides,
Mhm.
right? Which, it is genital mutilation is a form of mainstream violence, right? Of mass
Yeah.
violence is the word I'm looking for. And so, does it lead to, horrific outcomes? I think absolutely it could. And that's why we need to stop mutilating our children's genitals ASAP, because there's only negatives. And it's just so easy to do. It really is. It
Yeah.
requires nothing. It's an affirmative act to mutilate an infant, right? It's difficult to repair the damage we've done to the Earth's ecosystem, for example. It's
Yeah.
very easy to not take a scalpel to your child's genitals and sever important parts of it. So that's why I think this is like the lowest hanging fruit to improve society.
Exactly. I could not agree more. And I think we also know, historically and even in modern times, rape is used as a tool of war. And can you expand a little bit on the coupling of sex and violence and how that may play out in that landscape as well?
Well, I can expound upon it, but it would be pure conjecture. Or, there's a great psychologist, Ronald Goldman, who wrote a book, Psychology of Circumcision, or whatever it may be. Oh, The Hidden Trauma. That's what it was.
Yeah.
And he essentially talks about how, and we may mention this earlier, but circumcision was where sex and violence meet for the first time. And it kind of casts a shadow over a man's entire life. And although he may not be able to articulate this, and it may be subconscious, his first sexual act, because medical professionals have to sexually stimulate infants before they cut off part of the foreskin. It's the first sexual act is coupled with the greatest pain that most men will ever feel in their lives, right? And I mean, talk about an act of sadism to the highest degree. Now, how that affects individuals and how that promotes rape culture, I don't have the data to say, well, causally, you circumcise this many men, you have this many more rapes, right? But
Right.
it is an act of extreme sexual violence to circumcise an infant, to mutilate his sex organs, right? And it's contributing to this belief, whether it's spoken or acted out, that to baby boys, you do not have control over your own body. I am bigger and stronger than you, so I can do what I want to you. That is
Right.
what we are communicating to our men when we circumcise them as infants. And some of those men will act out a similar ethos when they sexually assault women or other men, right? It is, I can't say, well, this is the coefficient of how much circumcision increases rape, but
Right.
I would bet my life on it that if you could mutilate most of the men in your culture, their sex organs, then you're going to have more sexually violent men who are not good at communicating their feelings, who are not as effective at communicating their feelings. They're not as effective lovers because they literally do not have the anatomy to make love as they are supposed to. And I'm sure, and I know because I've experienced a lot of rage around this, and that was part of my play, which made people uncomfortable, but it is a totally valid and legitimate feeling to acknowledge this extreme violation of your body and be upset about it. I mean, of all the things to be upset about, this is, at the top of the list, right? This is
Yeah.
your body. This is the inviolate thing that you own and that you alone own. And it was horribly attacked as an infant, right? And you can't, reverse that. So, and you certainly can't reverse the trauma, even if you can, undergo therapies that would minimize it, right?
Right.
But so the reality is, I don't have like the exact coefficient, and nobody does, of how much circumcision increases sexual violence in the culture, but it is far more likely than not that the more you generally mutilate your infants, the more sexual dysfunction and sexual maladaptive behavior you're going to have in a society.
Right. Right. And you did mention the Middle East and North America are still kind of the main purveyors of this practice. And if we look at the way women are treated, especially in the Middle East, I think we can draw some parallels there, at least, as to contributing factors of the man-woman relating in that neck of the woods, which is unfortunate. And I don't know that we're going to make any progress there. We've got better hope in North America, obviously, but there's a definite connection there, I think, for sure.
Oh, definitely. I mean, what at least my law firm is going to focus on is secular genital mutilation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what the religions command you to do and what the religions command you to mutilate, like, that's not an argument that I'm interested in having, or my law firm's interested in having or pursuing, right? And that religious genital mutilation is really kind of the forte of the Middle East. That's what they do. They religiously mutilate all their children, and they're very proud of it. And, that's just nuts. And I don't really want to engage with it. Right? It's like, dude, you mutilate your babies. I'm strongly opposed to it, but I don't have the influence in the Middle East like I can have here in the United States of America.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm going to do. And the United States is a big exporter of culture as well. And so once we stop mutilating our children, and we will, and if you donate to Intact Global, you can help, then the rest of the world is going to take note that, we're no longer mutilating our kids. I think it was like Denmark or Iceland. They actually moved to outlaw it. And America came down with the influence of Israel to say, look, if you put any restrictions on generally mutilating boys, we're going to economically sanction you and brand you as Nazis effectively, right? And I think it was like the ADL sent a letter to that effect with like a bunch of congressmen signing on. It's like, we are going to punish you if you protect your baby boys. And that was America, right? I mean, obviously Israel, but also America. And so we as Americans need to stop this. This is absolutely absurd. We're not going to be influenced by these genitally mutilating nations, and we're going to do what is best for our children. And we're not going to kowtow to these religious individuals who say, well, my God requires me to mutilate my babies, and I will do anything I can to crush you if you say otherwise. It's like, we're not going to be intimidated by that anymore. And we're going to stand up and we're going to do what's best for our kids. And, if that requires some type of escalation, then we will do whatever is necessary. But this is no longer a debate. This is a final decision, and we're going to get it done. So, and I'm excited to do it, as you could tell. Like, this is my life's mission, which I hope takes 2 years, and then we can do other stuff.
Move on.
It's like, I'd like to move on. This is not something I'd like to do as a career. I want to get it done and be finished. Like, that's enough. That's how I feel. And I think most people feel that way. And that's why we're at 50%. Because, one other thing, because you say, we're at 50%, and that's a tipping point. And I agree with you, because a lot of social causes are exponential. But if you look at, what is the main indicator of whether someone or not recycles? Do you know what it is?
No.
It is whether or not their neighbors recycle. Right?
Oh, yeah.
They look at their neighbors recycling. They're like, I got to recycle. Right. I think I read that book called Influence.
That makes sense.
But, most people aren't circumcising their kids. I'm not going to do it either. Or most people aren't mutilating their kids. I'm not going to do it either. And so that's where we're rapidly heading. And that's why we're going to start in states that already protect most of their children from genital mutilation. So it's a very small step to say, look, we're just going to protect all our kids. That's what our Constitution requires. Yeah. And so that's my spiel.
All right.
Yeah.
I don't think a lot of people know this is a practice done on infants in our country, but there are other cultures where they specifically wait until a boy is old enough to remember it. And I think that's intentional. And I remember, when images are so much, and we can sit here and talk all day long, but if you're forced to actually look at an image of what we're actually describing here, that's a much more powerful way to move people, but it's been so censored on social media, especially. And there was one gentleman that I followed for a while, who had a completely intactivist account, and he had posted a photo at one point in time of a group circumcision of like roughly 7-8-year-old boys being circumcised by, I don't know if they were nurses or less skilled. I don't know what they were, but they were posting on social media, like with scalpels in hand and, naked boys behind them, with towels over their faces, to help with the pain and I don't know, privacy too, but, like laughing, like here we are, publicly having this mass circumcision of boys, and these women are posting on social media that they're performing it. And Brendan and I had a conversation about patriarchy, because he had a chapter in his book, that when I first read it, I was a little bit triggered, and by the end of the chapter, I was like, oh my God, he's completely right. That women, and I'll even include people of color and other oppressed groups, or non-white men, are largely purveyors of that which we're, raging against. We've blamed the patriarchy for so long, but yet women especially were the primary caregivers of children for the most part through the age of 18. And so these experiences that boys are having with the women who are taking care of them, this is an extreme example of that, really influences their relationship with women and even with themselves later in life. But on the Filipino example, so when I was researching some of this a few months ago, and I went and I found it was like on the Filipino tourism website.
Ooh, that's bizarre.
They actually had a page on how they circumcise boys and what the rite of passage is and so forth and so on. But as I was preparing for this interview, I went back to try to find that because I had bookmarked it and it's gone. So their PR department must have gotten wind of maybe on our tourist website, we shouldn't be
this is how we mutilate our boys here.
This is how we mutilate them. We want to make sure that they remember and, forget doing it as infants. It's just the different customs surrounding this, regardless which culture it is and how it's being done. It's almost like science fiction. I can't even fathom, like I said before, that we even have to have a conversation like this at this point. I wish that human beings had evolved right, to a level of collective consciousness where there's just an unspoken understanding that you love your babies and you nurture them when they come out of the womb. And I will say, from a mothering standpoint and a psychology standpoint, babies do not understand that they are even separate from their mothers at birth. So when you inflict this kind of harm on them at such a young, tender age, the level of damage, I don't think, is something that we're even capable of studying and quantifying. But this is all common sense. It should be at this point.
Well, so speaking of, a lot of boys are circumcised, 6 to 16 years old, right?
Yeah.
So, my firm will be doing a lot of equal protection litigation, but I either have or do represent, various actors and models. One model / influencer is a Filipino guy, about 28 years old. And when he was telling me in Los Angeles, when he was 14, he got circumcised. It wasn't in a public ritual. It was in a medical setting. He got anesthetized. But even when they saw him remove his foreskin, he felt a sense of being violated and raped, right?
Yeah.
It was not he didn't have the autonomy at 14 years old to stand up to his parents. He didn't have the accurate information at 14 years old to say, I don't want this. Don't do this to me. Yeah. And at 8 years old, it's even more. And at 1 day old, it's even, extreme, right? But the point is, whether you're 1 day old or 16 years old, most individuals in that range don't have the autonomy or the ability to make this important decision or avoid this wound until it's too late, right? Yeah. And most circumcisions in the world, male genital mutilation, is done by Muslim parents, right? They are the largest circumcising group by an incredible margin, just because there's way more Muslims than there are Jews, and there are way more Muslims than there are Americans, right? So that's in a lot of Muslims, and it ranges because Islam has many different ways to practice it, and some of the more enlightened ways don't mutilate their kids, right? But most do. And a lot of Islamic circumcision is done by barbers, right? They cut your hair and they mutilate your penis. And, it can be done from 6 to 16, and it's seen as a rite of passage. Like, okay, you're a boy, you're a man, you're a boy. Now we cut off your penis, a big part of it, and now you're a man. Why? Because it happened to the adult males, and instead of confronting that and saying, oh, maybe it shouldn't have been done to me, they do it to their child, because then they don't have to confront the reality that maybe their religion led them astray, or their culture, or their parents. But at least from the few men I've spoken to who have been circumcised as young adults, they say they remember it, they feel a sense of extreme violation, and they wish it never happened. I mean, after this podcast, I have a lunch with someone in the hills who's like, really wants to meet me because he was circumcised at 16, and it's his life's mission now to stop it because it was the worst thing that ever happened to him. Yeah. So just because it happened to you as an adult doesn't make it, or as a young adult or a boy, doesn't mean that it still wasn't terrible. And oftentimes I hear, I remember the violation, right? But it's not something that my client would have told me unless he knew that I was like hardcore activist and advocate in the space. It's not like he tells his circumcision story to many people, and I didn't ask about it, but he's like, well, this is why I feel passionate as to why we need to end male genital mutilation. And he shared with me his story. So, and like I said, America is, and as we know, America is a big exporter of culture. So once we stop mutilating our baby boys, that's going to be very influential on the rest of the world, whether they circumcise at birth or as a young adult.
Right. And I think that would be a much better thing to export than McDonald's. So,
oh, yeah, exactly. But if I had to, I would take my foreskin and eat McDonald's. But if there was a choice, and I used to love that, but it's just so unhealthy for you. It's like, it's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. So on the legal note, so what legal recourse, and have there been any precedent set so far in terms of legal cases that have been brought to states?
So there have been other cases in Europe, like a German court in Cologne said, look, it's child abuse and it violates human rights of the child, right? And then politicians bent under political pressure from Israel, et cetera, which, it is what it is. Like maybe over 30 years ago, there was individuals who tried to litigate this equal protection issue. But this was, I think, before we even had anti-female genital mutilation statutes. So the reality is the culture wasn't ready. And I only know of one case. I don't think that it went well, but this was like in the 90s, I believe. So there's not really good precedent. There's not timely precedent. And I think it's time to just go full bore. This is what we're doing, equal protection of children from genital mutilation on a constitutional basis in as many states as we responsibly can do so. And the reality is we don't need to win every lawsuit. All you need to do as an attorney is you need to have a good faith legal basis to bring the lawsuit. And let me tell you, I am very earnest in my belief that all children should be equally protected, right?
Yeah.
No question. And it has compelling anatomical, ethical, biological background that, these homologous structures should be protected in both boys and girls, and also the civil and human rights that are analogous to keeping those important parts of your body. So, but what's likely to happen is we might win some, we might lose some. But as soon as we win one state, other states are going to say, look, we're not going to be holding on to this genital mutilation of boys. I think it's going to look very bad historically if any judge rules against my clients who are just trying to get a declaration that baby boys deserve the same human rights and protections against genital mutilation as baby girls. It's a very simple and compelling argument. And there may be a state court judge or an appellate court who rules against that. And that opinion is going to, it's not going to age well, put it that way. You're going to look extremely ignorant if you are sitting on a bench and saying, you know what, I think that we should protect baby girls, but we should allow the continued mutilation of baby boys. And there's a whole bunch of jurisprudence around what's a religious right versus, what is not protected under, the religious amendments of the federal or state constitutions. And I'm not talking about religious circumcisions here. Yeah. We're talking about non-religious male genital mutilation. That's the focus of these lawsuits. And if someone else wants to litigate that, religious circumcision is protected, well, that's not what we are going to be arguing. But to answer your question, is there good precedent of similar challenges? Not that I'm aware of, but I'm very optimistic that there will be in the near future, right? We just need essentially the resources. So if you donate to intactglobal.org, that will help move the mission along. And the more money we raise, the more attorneys I can hire to either improve my work or to do the litigation on their own. But right now, my law firm is going to be focused on primarily this and, representing some models and some actors and actresses in LA, but mostly protecting children from genital mutilation, depending on how much we raise. Because it is kind of expensive to do high quality litigation. I can do it at cost because I've been litigating for almost 4 years very intensely now. But the more we raise, the quicker we can go and the more states we can raise this issue in.
Yeah. So if you were a man who is compelled to pursue this in a legal sense because you feel like you've been violated and your personal autonomy has been compromised, what are the steps that somebody would need to go through to say, hey, I would really like to bring this to the courts?
So the clients that I'm looking to represent, and I have a great client, Mason in Oregon, young man, kind, intelligent. He watched my play at Harvard, I think earlier in 2024 this year. And he said, oh, wow, I didn't know that the foreskin was so important, that this important part of my body was stolen from me and my human rights were violated. Right. Yeah. And the reason why he's a good client is not only is he a good person and just wants to see the other children in Oregon be afforded the same protections as baby girls in Oregon, and that he was not afforded. But I am looking for plaintiffs who were circumcised in their home state after that state passed its anti-female genital mutilation law. Oh. Because a big part of filing a lawsuit, especially a constitutional challenge, is the plaintiff needs to have what is called standing. Is you need to have suffered a harm to bring a legal challenge. And if you were circumcised before your state passed the anti-female genital mutilation statute, well, the state could easily argue, look, whatever the merits of, protecting children from genital mutilation is, this anti-female genital mutilation law didn't harm the plaintiff because it didn't exist until after the plaintiff was born. So so the plaintiff didn't suffer harm from the statute because no statute passed at the time that the anti-FGM statute was passed could have protected the man who was circumcised if he was circumcised before the anti-FGM statute. So I'm essentially looking for men who have an anti-FGM statute in their state and who were circumcised after it. And intactglobal.org will have will essentially what's called a spreadsheet or some visual that will tell you what type of plaintiffs I'm looking for in which states. And I'm looking in like 20 or 30 states, right? This is not like a small operation, right? So
do all states have anti-female circumcision laws or statutes?
I actually have a spreadsheet made by GalDef, who is a collaborator of mine, the General Autonomy Legal Defense and Education Fund. And I'm just pulling up the spreadsheet right now, and it looks like 41 states.
Wow.
41. Wow. 41 states, according to their data. So, plus or minus 2, but just because there might be a mistake, I don't know. But about 40 states have anti-FGM laws.
Okay.
And they range from passing in 1995, like in Minnesota, Delaware, or Minnesota, to 2023, which is Washington State. Now, I'd have to double check this. Yeah. Well, according to GalDef research, there's 9 states, Alabama, Alaska, Connecticut, Hawaii, Maine, Mississippi, Montana, Nebraska, New Mexico. I am not looking for clients in those 9 states because apparently they do not have an anti-FGM law. Now, I didn't go through every single law from the 50 states to check. I was able to outsource that to GalDef, and they're a great partner, and I'm very grateful for them.
Yeah.
But almost 40 states, approximately 40, is I'm looking for plaintiffs. Now, let's say the anti-FGM law was passed in 2020, right? The plaintiff has to be 4 years old or younger. And so what I would do is, let's say you circumcise your child, and then you later found out, oh, wow, this was a great harm, and I wish I hadn't, but the doctor told me to do so, and I trusted the doctor who, enriched himself off of my ignorance, and now I'm upset, and I wish that all children were protected. Let's say you're a parent who fits that category, called a regret parent. You could contact me if your child was born and circumcised after 2020, let's say, if you were in the state of Kentucky or Massachusetts, which is where I'm from, right? I'd love to sue the state of Massachusetts. But so those are the type of, to help them improve their laws, not to fight them,
I get it.
Because I would like all boys in Massachusetts to be protected where I was born. So those are the type of clients I'm looking for. So it's very broad. It encompasses tens of millions of potential clients probably. And the other requirement is the state needs, so I didn't know very much about the law until I went to law school, beyond the basics, right? And so everyone's aware of the federal constitution. So you have the First Amendment, freedom of speech and religion, the Second Amendment, guns, and so on and so forth, right? Well, each state has their own constitution as well. And each state's law needs to abide by that state's constitution. So what I'm looking for in my clients, and Oregon's a good example because that's where the Clopper law firm will be suing first, is the state's constitution needs to have some guarantee of equal protection of the laws for all its citizens. And if it has an amendment that says explicitly, we do not discriminate on the basis of gender, that's even better, because an anti-female genital mutilation statute, as noble and as important as it is, on its face discriminates on the basis of gender because it only protects one class of children. And we want to protect all class of children. And for that law to abide by that state's constitution, which it must, it cannot discriminate on which children it protects from genital mutilation.
Yeah.
So those are the 2 requirements. intactglobal.org is going to lay it out in a visual and in text. So if you want to be a plaintiff and say, look, I want to bring equal protection of the laws to my state, then you can get in touch with me at eric@clopper.com or put in your info at intact.global or my law firm website. Very easy to reach. I get a lot of correspondence, so you have to be patient. But if you're like a potential plaintiff, then I'm very interested in talking. And also, if you want to help, I need local counsel in each state, right, to file a lawsuit, because I'm licensed in California right now only for now. And so since I'm suing the state of Oregon on behalf of Mason, I have local counsel. His name is Bradley, and he already has experience in protecting children from genital mutilation. He was one of the attorneys who actually brought a circumcision case up to the Oregon Supreme Court. Bolt v. Bolt. It was a custody case where there was a teenage boy and two parents who were separating. The father converted to Orthodox Judaism and wanted to circumcise his young man, right? His probably young teens or
Yeah.
maybe even like 12, tween, whatever. And the young boy was like, I don't want to have part of my penis cut off. And so it became a big court battle, went up to the Supreme Court. And at some point in the proceedings, the young man actually testified on the stand and said, look, right in front of his dad, I don't want to be circumcised because, I want my entire penis. I know it's painful. And, I don't know his exact wording, but that was the gist of it, right?
Yeah.
Can you imagine being a young boy, have to go to court and say,
I can't even imagine the level of bravery that took for him.
It's just a kangaroo ridiculousness that he had to go to that length. And I'm glad that he did, because the father was just off the rails, unhinged. But anyways, Brad, my local co-counsel, Lekman Sue, he represented the boy after he won in the Supreme Court and ensured that he was protected to adulthood. So Bradley Lekman Sue, great co-counsel, local counsel in the Oregon case, but I need local counsel in each state that I'm going to sue to essentially file the lawsuit and do some of the civil procedure stuff. And I'm happy to pay local counsel if we raise the money to do so, right? And if you want to see this happen, donate to intactglobal.org. But that's the strategy. And if I could do this all in a year, I would sue 20 states in a year. I could do that if I had appropriate funding. Because, I've been a professional litigator, like hardcore, for almost 2 years. And I've litigated very intensely for almost 4. Right? Because my first lawsuit was against Harvard, where I did a lot of the work myself when I was a law student at Georgetown. So I've been litigating for a long time, and I'm very good at it. I'm very efficient at it, proficient, but it still costs considerable resources to do it well. But if you were to compare my law firm's cost to other law firms, it's really incomparable in terms of the amount of legal work we get per dollar and the value of that legal work in this arena. I'm not discounting all my services, but for protecting children from genital mutilation, no question. I'll work with whatever resources are raised.
Okay. All right. Were there cases of FGM in some of these states that necessitated the statute be put in place? Because I have to imagine, most of these states, to some extent, just didn't know there was even a need to protect girls from having their genitals mutilated.
Well, what happened is in the 1990s, like 95, 96, this very brave activist from Africa was claiming asylum in America. Say, look, if you send me back, I'm going to have my genitals mutilated. And America didn't recognize that as a real harm in the 90s, right? Like after I was born. And there was great legal advocacy who got, CNN got involved, I believe, or 60 Minutes, like some major mainstream who aired this activist story. And because they used the term mutilation, because that's what it is, female genital mutilation, people were like, oh, we're against mutilation, as they should be. And so public opinion turned. That's why I always use male genital mutilation, because that's what it is. Right. And so there was great advocacy in 95, 96, 97, 98, where there's awareness was rising that, women's genitals are being mutilated, or baby girls, and we need to stop that because that's an obvious violation of their human rights, extreme pain, lifelong sexual dysfunction, all the things with male genital mutilation, right? Yeah. And so that's why these laws banning female genital mutilation, according to Galdef research, started in 95. And there was a whole string of them from 1995 to 1999. There was approximately 13 states who banned it right away, right? And then there was an anti-FGM law, federal anti-FGM law in 1996. So I don't believe there was a lot of state lawsuits or stories. It was this brave activist from Africa who really raised awareness, and in the mainstream media, because it didn't have any allegiance to female genital mutilation, religious or cultural or otherwise, was quick to denounce this practice that they don't engage in, right? Yeah. But there was a recent case in Michigan where this Islamic doctor was practicing female genital mutilation, right? Yeah. And the defense counsel challenged it, saying, look, the federal government doesn't have the power to outlaw female genital mutilation under the Commerce Clause, a very like legal autistic argument, right? And it prevailed. The federal judge, just as a matter of federalism, meaning, how the state and federal governments share and delegate certain types of authority, that it wasn't in the federal government's power to ban this type of child abuse against women. Mm-hmm. So the female Islamic doctor, she was no longer prosecuted. It was dropped because of pure federalist issues. But the federal government amended the female genital mutilation statute, and for all intents and purposes right now, it still exists. Which is also great because it means all of my law firm's legal challenges against the constitutionality of anti-female genital mutilation statutes will not endanger the welfare of those girls in those states because they're still protected from genital mutilation from the federal statute. So there's really no bad outcome except raising awareness and providing legislatures the opportunity to pass laws that pass constitutional muster and protect all children equally from genital mutilation. Mm-hmm. So that's a very long way to answer your question. There was one case about female genital mutilation I know of, like in 2018 approximately. And then before that, I think I'm not aware of any like high profile cases. But there was that activist who really raised awareness of the issue in America in like 96 or so.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's mind-boggling that we even need these laws. But is there any potential recourse or legal action, say, in the case of two parents where one signs a consent form against the other one's wishes?
That may vary by state. I believe informed consent became a thing in the 70s because there were certain surgeries that were done without the consent of either the patient or the parents, depending on the age of the patient. And I would wager that most of that is a state by state law, as in what constitutes informed consent, although the state laws often overlap, right? But they're not the same, which is one of the reasons you need to get licensed in each state to practice law. But I do not know in terms of how many parents need to consent to a circumcision. It would vary by state, right? There was a law in New Hampshire that lost by a narrow margin that required both parents to sign the consent form, and it put in 12-point, which is not that big, but 12-point bold font at the front saying this is a medically unnecessary surgery, and then it listed all the complications from bleeding, infection, loss of penis, death. I mean, incredibly serious things. I mean, babies die from this, like dozens at least every year in America alone, because people don't realize this is a major surgery / amputation, right? But it would vary by state and maybe even by hospital how many parents need to sign the consent form. But it's usually at least one, because they used to just circumcise infants without asking the parents. It used to just be part of like the birth, the birth checklist. How can the hospital maximize money for every baby born? Right. So,
the sales funnel. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Huh. So, can we shift gears a little bit? I want to kind of go back to kind of the coupling of sex with violence, and what impact or association do you think there is between circumcision as a routine procedure in North American culture and what we're seeing play out in what I'll call porn culture?
Well, they're definitely connected, right? In that, and you circumcise an infant or a man or whoever, when you steal that foreskin, you change the mechanics of intercourse. And because, like I mentioned earlier, the foreskin's a bilayer tissue, it folds in on itself, kind of like the lips. It's extremely sensitive. To get great sexual pleasure, if you have an intact penis, if you're not circumcised, you only need to move very little inside the woman, right? It is much more of like a dance, where your hips are essentially aligned, and the
Mhm.
clitoris gets more stimulated because you're not moving away from the body, the female's or your partner's body. Whereas if you're circumcised, you have, in small percentage, probably 10, maybe 30% of the sensory tissue that you would otherwise have. And to get some comparable level of sexual sensation, you need to do huge strokes, which moves you away from the female's body, away from the clitoris, reduces the amount of female orgasms. Like I mentioned earlier, there are 50% less female orgasms if you're circumcised, if your partner's circumcised. And so what happens is we exaggerate this behavior in pornography, and you have this jackhammering effect where you have these large circumcised penises that are not representative of actual size, and they are just pounding these women. And it's not how you're supposed to make love. It's not how women experience sexual pleasure and orgasms. And because pornography is so accessible, to anyone with an internet connection, especially at a young age, you have a lot of men's sexuality being formed by these gross characterizations of dysfunctional sex because the man doesn't have all the parts of his penis he's supposed to.
Yeah.
So, and if you look at who's running the porn industry in California, most of them are circumcised, and it just perpetuates their delusions of normality, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah. I do think there's an element too of, if you can control the sexuality of a culture, they become more submissive and easier to control as a populace, either from a religious or, a governmental standpoint. I don't necessarily know that that's done on a conscious level in most cases, although, maybe we can look to some like dystopian literature and, communist regimes where maybe that's more obvious than what we're seeing it play out, in the United States or similar type countries. But sexual energy is the bridge between the natural and the supernatural, or between the material and the ethereal. And I think these practices, including circumcision, including the perpetuation of porn culture, in some ways is intentional to degrade the capacity for what the sexual experience is supposed to be, and its ability to bring people closer to God and bring people closer to each other, by reducing it to this more mechanical act. And that's probably one of the bigger travesties, because back to, you don't know what you don't know until you do know. I think we largely live in this culture that just doesn't know. We've not had access to what our energetic and spiritual potentials are. And I don't mean religious, but I mean the ability to move energy in our bodies and to interconnect and co-create with somebody else's, in a way that's being destroyed. And if we can get past these handful of years in front of us where I do see good things happening in this respect, I think the potential on a more broader cultural and even global scale are fascinating. I'm interested to see where things go, if we can keep things moving in a great direction. And I think you're doing beautiful work to that end. I think, like you said, hopefully this is the next couple of years of your life, not your lifelong career.
No, I'd like to finish this immediately. I'm not at all running out of steam. I'm like just gearing up, but at the same time, this is not like a lifelong fight. This is, if you're passionate about this and you want to see the genital mutilation of children end, then you can support us at intactglobal.org and become a monthly donor. But not only that, like, this can be done in a matter of years, but we just need to have some support. And this is asymmetric battle, like most are, right? Because the sides are not of equal moral value, equal resources. And because, I probably need to raise $1 for every $1,000 the opposition spends, only because the opposition is so contemptible that they mutilate infants for profit. It is hard to conceive of a more wicked position to defend. And that's why they need an incredible infrastructure and resources to defend it. But I think this can be done in a matter of years, 2-ish years, if we are just organized, and just a small percentage of those of us who feel strongly about protecting children donate or get involved. Yeah. And, you could just share this podcast, right? You could tell your friends who are going to, have a baby, a male baby. There are easy things you can do. Subscribe to your channel, subscribe to mine, right? So these are things that can be done on a, very easy individual level. Or if you're committed, donate money. Or if you're an attorney, reach out to me, blah, blah, blah. But going back to what you had said just recently, and we had a little conversation about this offline, but does circumcision, mutilating a child's genitals at birth, make them easier or more docile, right? And what evidence is for that? Well, if we go back to the circumcision that America adopted, the Jewish circumcision, if you read Genesis 17, verse 13, allegedly God says, which is just a rabbi rewriting the Bible, whether born in your household or bought with your money, they must be circumcised, right? And so the religious covenant is literally, you need to circumcise your infants and your slaves, right? And you're not circumcising your slaves because you want to empower them. You're doing it because it makes them easier to control. It's like, why other cultures would castrate their slaves, because then they wouldn't be a sexual threat. Now, Jewish culture couldn't castrate their Jewish boys because then they wouldn't reproduce. So this was a half step towards castration, right? We're just going to remove most of the sexual pleasure. We're not actually going to make you sterile. So, and if you look at, why American doctors began to promote circumcision in the medical sense, it was to prevent them from masturbating, right? And reducing sexual pleasure from the act, which is a form of sexual control. Right. So, and there was a lot of justified complaints about how female sexuality is not respected and honored in America. And that definitely is the case. And it's also the same for men who have big parts of their genitals amputated at birth. Yeah. So I think if you look in the American medical history or the religious history, both support the argument that circumcision is done to control you, to reduce your sexual senses, and to make you, let's say, to traumatize and make you easier to do what those in power would like you to. Yeah. And I think most adult men and women who are autonomous and proud to be who they are, and let's say are just healthy, independent-minded people, they're not down with that, and they don't want their children to suffer from that. So this is a freedom movement in a way. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Can you briefly give us a rundown, because I just want to make sure this story is shared in this podcast, the history involving John Harvey Kellogg?
Yes. So John Harvey Kellogg is the guy who you may recognize from, cornflakes, right? Yeah. Kellogg cornflakes. Yeah. And he was also like a fanatically religious doctor at the turn of the 20th century, around 1900, right? And so he promoted cornflakes back, in around 1900, because they were so bland that they were supposed to reduce your desire for sexual intercourse. That was like a selling point. And he actually published a book called Treatment for Self-Abuse and Its Effects in 1888. And self-abuse was a euphemism for masturbation, right? And so this guy, who was influential in getting America to adopt circumcision, he promoted it because he knew that the foreskin was very erogenous and very important in masturbation. And so if you were to remove this tissue from baby boys and young men, it's harder for them to masturbate. But the same guy also, John Harvey Kellogg, advocated for burning the clitorises of young girls with carbolic acid. And he also recommended using chastity cages on children so they couldn't touch their genitals. He even advocated for tying up or restraining children so they couldn't, masturbate. I mean, he was off the rails by modern standards.
God, I wonder what happened to him as a child.
Right? Yeah,
Right?
he had some adverse childhood events, as they would say.
Apparently.
Yeah. So, yeah. So John Harvey Kellogg, he was like one of the bigger secular promoters of circumcision. I mean, it's just such a ludicrous history, and it's such a ludicrous practice that's so overtly violent and sadistic,
Mhm.
right? And when you look into it, it makes no sense at all. And there's this saying in the movement to protect children from genital mutilation that a lot of people have this obsessive epiphany
Mhm.
where they have this epiphany, oh my God, this circumcision was all a lie. It's male genital mutilation. It's incredibly painful and detrimental to your health for the rest of your life and violates your human rights. They have this epiphany and they obsess over it because once they understand this, it's so obvious. It is so
Right.
obvious.
Right.
So yeah, and John Harvey Kellogg's a good example. Like you said, oh, these are the people who are advocating for the other side. It's like, yeah, that's because it's totally twisted and warped to mutilate an infant.
Right. Right. Um, and just one more note on, our example of, creating a more docile populace. I think your puppy analogy is a really good one that people can maybe relate to better if you're relating, or if you have a puppy who's raised in a very loving household and doesn't even know what trauma is versus one that's coming from the shelter who's been beaten and abused and neglected, and observe how their behavior is throughout life. You're probably going to either see aggression and or a withdrawing, and fear of interaction with people when they've been abused as a puppy. And they're going to be, from that respect, easier to control. So, I mean, this has been like a fantastic conversation. I'm so grateful that you were able to share some time with us today, and bring some more awareness to our listeners. As I talk with more friends, and more mothers on the subject, I will just say, like, I've had a lot of conversations with moms in private on this subject, and those whose sons are circumcised. The reaction is almost always, I regret his circumcision, and it was because his father said he wanted to look like him, or we had family pressures and the doctor was pressuring us. It wasn't an emphatic like, oh yeah, this is, I felt good about doing this and it's what I've always known I've wanted to do for my son. So I think just the more, and this conversation also is not about shaming parents who made that decision. Like I said, you don't know what you don't know until you do know. And we do the best with the information we have at the time. And I think the biggest takeaway on that is to have the awareness and forgive yourself for what you didn't know. And encourage yourself to become the version of yourself that you would like to be, and be that example for your children and your grandchildren and so forth. Is there anything else that we didn't talk about that you think would be important for our listeners to know about?
I think we covered a lot of ground. I'm really
Yeah,
grateful for the invitation to be on your podcast. So thank you, Jen.
absolutely. Yep.
And if anyone else wants me on the podcast, they can email me at eric@clopper.com.
Okay.
And if they feel passionate about protecting children from genital mutilation and want to support my law firm's efforts to end this type of child abuse, then they can become a monthly donor at intactglobal.org.
Great.
Other than that, I'm really grateful that you're bringing attention to this issue. I'm very grateful you invited me on your podcast. And I'm hoping that in a couple years, we will be in a much, much better position. And, that 50% circumcision rate goes down to, 10 or 5%. That would be a great outcome.
Absolutely.
And, I'm working on it as hard as I can. And all the support we can get is greatly appreciated. So, thank you, Jen. Thank you, listeners. And, we'll be in touch, hopefully.
All right. Is there any place people can find you on social media?
Yes, there is. I'm in the process of rebranding and making all my websites right now.
Okay.
By the time this is out, they'll probably be out.
Okay.
But my personal website is clopper.com.
Okay.
And my handles will probably be Attorney Clopper, but we'll see.
Okay. And if we have that at the time we publish, I will definitely include in the show notes.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Jen.
Yeah, no problem. So thanks for coming on. It's been a fantastic conversation.
This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only. Any statements and views expressed by myself or my guests are not medical advice. The opinions of guests are their own, and the Body Literacy Podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. If you have a medical problem, please consult a qualified and competent medical professional. As always, I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Body Literacy Podcast. Be sure to subscribe and sign up for updates over at jenmayo.com.